Sometimes the wilderness teaches us that we're never truly alone, even when we think we are. And sometimes the past has a way of finding us, no matter how far we run. Della Rusk spent 30 years as a fire lookout in the Idaho mountains. At 62, she thought retirement meant finally finding peace in the backcountry with just her German shepherd by her side. Then one morning, she woke to find a massive black wolf standing at the edge of her tent. What her dog did next changed everything. The wolf didn't attack, it just watched, and it kept coming back. Soon Della realized something impossible. This wasn't just about surviving in the wild. It was about a woman who vanished in these same woods decades ago, and a mystery that wouldn't stay buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The frost had come early to the Selkirk Mountains that year. Della Rusk noticed it the moment she unzipped her tent that morning, saw the white crystals clinging to the pine needles, and heard the particular silence that comes when the world holds its breath between seasons. She'd been noticing these details for 30 years, first from her fire lookout tower perched at 7,000 feet, and now from ground level, where the forest felt both more intimate and more vast. Kerrick pushed his nose against her hand, warm and insistent. The German shepherd had been with her for 5 years now, adopted from a search and rescue program after her husband Tom died. The dog had washed out of the program for being too gentle, too thoughtful. They'd told her he lacked the necessary aggression for rescue work. Della thought that made him perfect. "Morning, boy," she said, scratching behind his ears. "Let's see what we've got today." She crawled out of the tent into the September dawn, her knees protesting slightly. 62 wasn't old. She reminded herself of that daily, but it wasn't young either. Her body kept a careful accounting of 3 decades spent climbing tower stairs, hiking rough terrain, and living through mountain winters that could break a person's spirit if they weren't careful. The campsite she'd chosen sat in a small clearing surrounded by lodgepole pines, about 15 miles into the backcountry from the nearest trailhead. She'd packed in enough supplies for 2 weeks, though she might stay longer if the weather held. Her daughter Linda worried about these solo trips. Her son Marcus had stopped calling them trips and started calling them Mom's walkabouts, said with the kind of gentle concern that made Della feel both loved and ancient. But they didn't understand. They couldn't. How could they know what it meant to spend your working life watching over something vast and wild, only to have that purpose stripped away by a retirement party and a gold watch? The Forest Service had thanked her for her service, handed her a plaque, and expected her to be content with a condo in Coeur d'Alene and weekend visits from the grandkids. She'd tried it for 6 months. The condo had been Tom's dream. He'd picked it out the year before. The heart attack took him, talking about how they'd spend their golden years together, maybe take up golf, visit the grandchildren more often. But Tom wasn't there to share it, and Della found herself standing at the window every morning, looking toward the mountains, feeling like something vital was slowly being drained from her bones. So she'd started hiking. Small trips at first, then longer ones. She kept the condo, Linda had a key, and Della returned every few weeks to check mail and reassure her children she hadn't become a complete hermit. But the mountains were where she felt most herself, most connected to the life she'd built and the man she'd loved. Tom had been a ranger, which was how they'd met. She'd been 28, newly assigned to the Granite Peak Lookout Tower, and he'd hiked up to check on her during her first week. He'd expected to find a man. They usually assigned men to the remote towers back then, and his surprise, when she opened the door, had been almost comical. But he'd recovered quickly, had helped her set up her equipment, and had come back the following week with better coffee than the instant stuff she'd been drinking. They'd married 2 years later. Tom kept working as a ranger, while Della kept her post on the tower. They'd see each other every few weeks when he could make the climb, and every winter they'd have 5 straight months together at lower elevation. It had been unconventional, but it had worked. They'd learned early that they were both people who needed space to breathe, who understood that loving someone didn't mean crowding them. The lookout tower work had suited her in ways she'd never quite been able to explain to people who hadn't done it. The solitude, yes, but more than that, the sense of purpose that came from being watchful, from having eyes on the forest when it needed protection. She'd spotted dozens of fires over the years, called them in before they could spread and consume. She'd watched weather patterns develop, had learned to read the sky like some people read books. And she'd learned the mountains themselves, every ridge and valley in her sector, every creek and meadow. She'd watched them through all seasons, had seen them in ways that ground-level visitors never could. From up high, you saw patterns. You understood how everything connected. Kerrick nosed at her pack, reminding her that philosophy didn't make breakfast. She pulled out the camping stove and started heating water for coffee and oatmeal. The dog got his kibble, and a piece of jerky she'd made herself last month. He ate with careful, measured bites, watching the tree line while he chewed. "You're a good boy," she told him. "Best partner I could ask for." The morning routine was meditative: boil water, cook simple food, clean up carefully to avoid attracting bears. She'd learned these habits decades ago, and they'd become second nature. Tom used to joke that she could break camp in her sleep, and he'd probably been right. After breakfast, she walked the perimeter of the clearing, checking for animal signs. Black bear scat about 50 yards east, a day or two old. Elk tracks near the small creek that bordered the southern edge of the camp. Mouse holes in the deadfall logs. Everything normal, everything as it should be. She pulled out her old logbook then, a habit she couldn't quite break, even though no one was paying her to record observations anymore. The book was from 1993, her first full year at Granite Peak. She'd kept every journal from every season, had boxes of them in storage, but she'd brought this particular one because it held a memory she'd been trying to place. Flipping through the pages, she found the entries from late August that year. She'd noted unusual smoke signals, 3 days running small, controlled fires that weren't forest fires, weren't lightning strikes. She'd reported them to the ranger station, and Tom had hiked out to investigate. He'd found nothing, no sign of anyone in that sector. The smoke had stopped after that 3rd day, and never returned. She remembered asking Tom about it when he'd visited her the following week. He'd seemed puzzled by it himself, had said the coordinates she'd given were solid, but there'd been no evidence of recent human activity. The mystery had bothered her for a while, but then winter had come, and other things had taken precedence. Now, looking at the faded entries, she couldn't say exactly why she'd brought the journal on this trip. Just a nagging sense that she'd missed something important back then, that those smoke signals had meant more than she'd understood. "Getting old makes you sentimental," she told Kerrick. "Start seeing connections where there aren't any." But the dog was staring at the tree line again, his ears forward in that particular way that meant he'd heard or smelled something worth noting. Della followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual. Just pine trees, shadows, the ordinary wilderness. "What is it, boy?" Kerrick glanced at her, then back at the trees. Not alarmed exactly, but alert. Interested. She decided to trust his instincts. One of the first things they'd taught her in fire lookout training was to pay attention when something felt off, even if you couldn't immediately identify why. The brain processed more information than the conscious mind could track. Instinct was just pattern recognition you couldn't quite articulate yet. She spent the rest of the morning hiking a wide loop around the camp, checking the area more thoroughly. The weather was perfect, clear skies, temperature in the low 60s, a light breeze from the west. Ideal hiking conditions, the kind of day that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with this work in the first place. By noon she'd covered maybe 5 miles, moving at the steady pace she'd developed over decades. Not fast, but efficient. She stopped for lunch by a beaver pond, watching the ripples on the water while Kerrick investigated the muddy banks. This was what she'd missed in the condo. Not just the wilderness itself, but the way time moved differently out here. No clocks, no schedules, nothing but the sun's arc across the sky and your body's own rhythms. She'd tried to explain it to Linda once, how city time felt artificial and cramped, but her daughter had just looked worried and asked if she'd thought about seeing someone, maybe talking to a therapist about the grief. Della hadn't been offended. Linda meant well, and maybe there was something to it. Maybe this was all just elaborate avoidance of the empty condo and the life she was supposed to want now that Tom was gone and her working years were behind her. But it didn't feel like avoidance. It felt like coming home. She made it back to camp by mid-afternoon, made another circuit of the perimeter, and started preparing dinner. Dehydrated stew, instant rice, a packet of green beans. Not fancy, but calories were calories, and the longer you could make your supplies last, the longer you could stay out. Carrick ate his dinner and then settled by the fire pit, resting his head on his paws but keeping his eyes on the darkening forest. The sun was setting earlier now, October only a week away. Soon the nights would get cold enough that camping would become genuinely uncomfortable. She'd stay through the end of September, then head back to the condo for a few weeks, before deciding whether to do another trip in October or wait until spring. As full dark settled over the clearing, Della banked the fire to coals and retreated to her tent. She'd learned long ago not to keep the fire burning all night. It disturbed the wildlife and created a false sense of security. Better to trust your shelter and your dog and let the forest be itself. Inside the tent, she arranged her sleeping bag and checked that her headlamp was within easy reach. Carrick circled twice before lying down across the tent entrance, his usual position. Guard dog to the end. "Good night, boy," she whispered. She was asleep within minutes, the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that came from physical exertion and clean mountain air. She didn't know how long she'd been under when Carrick's low growl pulled her back to consciousness. The growl was barely audible, more vibration than sound, but it jolted Della awake with the electric clarity of danger recognized. Carrick never growled without cause. In 5 years, she'd heard that sound maybe 3 times, once for a bear that had wandered too close to their camp, once for a strange man who'd approached her too aggressively at a trailhead, and once for reasons she'd never identified. Some threat that had passed in the night without revealing itself. She reached for her headlamp, but stopped before turning it on. Better to let her eyes adjust to the darkness first. Better to listen and learn before announcing her awareness. The tent was pitch black, the kind of darkness that only exists miles from any artificial light. But through the mesh window near her head, she could make out the faint shapes of trees silhouetted against a sky full of stars. No moon tonight. New moon phase. Carrick's growl came again, low and steady. He was on his feet now, she could tell from the sound, positioned at the tent entrance with his body blocking the way in. Then she saw it. Just beyond the tent's vestibule, maybe 6 feet away, a shape that didn't belong. Too large to be a coyote, too solid to be a shadow. As her eyes adjusted, the shape resolved into something that made her breath catch in her throat, a wolf. Massive, black-furred, standing perfectly still and staring directly at the tent. Della had seen wolves before. You couldn't spend 30 years in Idaho's backcountry without encountering them, but never like this. Never this close, never this calm. Wolves were shy creatures generally, avoiding human contact when possible. They hunted elk and deer, lived in family groups, and wanted nothing to do with people. This wolf seemed to want something very specific. It stood there, unmoving, its eyes catching some ambient starlight and reflecting it back with an almost luminous quality. Della found herself counting heartbeats, waiting for what would happen next. Carrick's growl had dropped to barely a rumble, his body tense but not attacking. That was the strangest part. Carrick should have been losing his mind, barking, lunging, defending his territory and his person with the full force of his 80-pound frame. Instead, he was growling, yes, but it was an alert, not an attack. He was warning her, not threatening the wolf. The wolf took 1 step closer, then another. It moved with the fluid certainty of something that had made this journey many times before and knew exactly where it was going. Della's hand found the canister of bear spray she kept near her sleeping bag. Her fingers closed around it, but she didn't lift it, didn't aim. Some instinct told her that spraying this animal would be a profound mistake, though she couldn't have explained why. The wolf stopped at the tent's vestibule, close enough now that she could see the details of its face, the slight graying around its muzzle that suggested age, the intelligence in its eyes that seemed almost human in its intensity. It looked at her for a long moment, and Della felt something pass between them, some communication that had no words but carried weight nonetheless. Then the wolf turned and walked back into the forest, disappearing between the trees as silently as it had come. Della sat frozen for several seconds, her hand still gripping the bear spray, her heart hammering against her ribs. Carrick stood at the tent entrance, his body finally relaxing, his tail giving a small, uncertain wag. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. The dog looked back at her, and she could have sworn he looked as confused as she felt. She didn't sleep again that night. She sat in her sleeping bag with the headlamp on, listening to every sound the forest made, waiting for the wolf to return. But it didn't. The rest of the night passed in ordinary silence, wind in the pines, an owl hunting somewhere to the north, the small rustlings of mice and voles going about their nocturnal business. When dawn finally broke, Della crawled out of her tent on stiff legs and immediately began examining the ground around the campsite. The frost had come again overnight, heavier than the previous morning, and there in the white crystals she found what she was looking for. Paw prints. Massive ones, far larger than any dog's tracks. The wolf had circled the tent twice before approaching the entrance, and the prints were preserved perfectly in the frost, each pad distinct, each claw mark visible. She knelt beside the clearest print and spread her hand next to it. The wolf's paw dwarfed her palm. This wasn't just a large wolf, it was enormous, easily over 100 pounds, maybe closer to 140. Alpha male size, the kind of animal that would lead an entire pack. But what had it been doing here? Wolves didn't approach human camps like this. They didn't stand outside tents and stare. They didn't communicate with German shepherds through some unspoken language of growls and body posture. Della made coffee with shaking hands, trying to process what she'd witnessed. She was a rational person, trained in observation and analysis. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the wolf was habituated to humans, had been fed by campers, and lost its natural fear. Maybe it was sick, rabid, acting out of character. But it hadn't looked sick. It had looked purposeful, deliberate. She spent an hour breaking camp, deciding that the best course of action was to move to a different location. If the wolf returned and proved aggressive, she'd be in a dangerous situation. Better to relocate, put some distance between herself and whatever had happened last night. But as she was rolling up her tent, Carrick began digging near the fire pit, his paws scrabbling at the dirt with focused intensity. "What'd you find, boy?" He kept digging, and Della knelt beside him to see what had caught his attention. A few inches down, his paws uncovered something that made her sit back on her heels in surprise. A carving. Wooden, weathered, shaped like a wolf in mid-stride. It was maybe 6 inches long, carved from a dark wood she didn't immediately recognize. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Every detail of the wolf's anatomy was rendered with careful accuracy, from the muscle structure to the individual fur lines along its back. But what caught her attention were the markings carved into the base, symbols that looked almost like writing but weren't anything she recognized. Not Native American pictographs from any of the regional tribes she knew, not English, not Spanish, not any modern alphabet. Someone had carved this, had buried it near her fire pit, and she had no idea why or when. She turned the carving over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the smooth patina that came from age and handling. This wasn't some recent trinket. It was old, genuinely old, maybe decades or more. "Who left this here?" she asked the empty clearing. Carrick whined softly, looking toward the tree line. Following his gaze, Della saw something that made her blood run cold. The wolf was back, standing at the edge of the trees, watching her with those same intelligent eyes. In daylight it looked even larger than it had at night, its black coat glossy and healthy, its posture radiating a calm authority. Della stood slowly, the carving still in her hand. She and the wolf regarded each other across the clearing, 30 feet of space that felt simultaneously vast and far too small. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The wolf didn't move, didn't react. It simply watched her for another long moment, then turned and trotted into the forest, heading northeast. Della looked down at Kerrick. The dog was wagging his tail now, looking up at her with an expression that seemed almost expectant. "You want to follow it," she said. It wasn't a question. Kerrick's tail wagged harder. Della looked at the wooden carving in her hand, then at the massive paw prints in the frost, then at the forest where the wolf had disappeared. Every rational instinct told her to pack up and hike out, to report this to the Forest Service, to get back to civilization and safety. But something deeper, something that had nothing to do with rationality and everything to do with 30 years of watching and listening to these mountains, told her that would be a mistake. Whatever was happening here, whatever the wolf wanted, it was connected to something she needed to understand. She made a decision that surprised her, even as she made it. "All right," she said to Kerrick. "Let's find out what this is about." She shouldered her pack, double-checked her bearings, and started walking northeast, following the wolf into the deeper wilderness. The trail the wolf had taken wasn't really a trail at all, just a narrow passage through dense lodgepole pine that required Della to move sideways in places, her pack catching on low branches. Kerrick navigated it easily, his body lower to the ground, and twice he looked back at her as if wondering what was taking so long. "Not all of us have 4 legs," she muttered, untangling her jacket from a particularly stubborn branch. She'd been hiking for maybe 2 hours when the trees began to thin, and she caught her first glimpse of something man-made in the distance. A structure, weathered grey wood, barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest. As she got closer, she recognized it. The old Marble Creek Ranger Station, abandoned for at least 15 years, maybe longer. She'd been here once before, decades ago, when it was still operational. Tom had brought her down from the tower for a supply run, and they'd stopped here to visit with the ranger who'd been stationed there. She couldn't remember his name now, but she remembered the station itself. Solid construction, built to last, positioned at the confluence of 2 creeks where the water was reliable year-round. The wolf was nowhere to be seen, but its tracks continued right up to the station's front steps. Della approached carefully, Kerrick close at her side. The windows were intact but filthy, and the door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Someone had padlocked it at some point, but the lock was broken now, hanging uselessly from the hasp. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the dirty light filtering through the windows, but her eyes adjusted quickly. The main room was mostly intact, a desk, filing cabinets, a wood stove, shelves that had once held supplies. Everything was covered in dust and mouse droppings, and the air smelled of old wood and decay. But someone had been here recently. She could see it in the disturbed dust on the floor, the footprints that weren't hers, leading to the filing cabinets in the corner. Della moved to the cabinets and tried the top drawer. Locked. The second drawer was locked too, but the third one opened with a screech of protesting metal. Inside she found old files, paperwork from the station's operational days, incident reports, supply requisitions, weather logs, the mundane bureaucracy of Forest Service work. She was about to close the drawer when something caught her eye, a manila folder, newer than the others, not as yellowed with age. She pulled it out and opened it. Missing Persons Report. The header was stamped with the date, the 15th of September, 1993. Her hands started trembling before she even read the name. Una Brightwell. Female, 47 years old. Last seen the 28th of August, 1993, near the Marble Creek drainage. Vehicle found at trailhead, tent and supplies missing. Extensive search conducted September 1 to 12. No trace found. Case remains open. There was a photograph clipped to the inside of the folder. A driver's license photo. The kind that never quite captures a person properly. But even in that unflattering bureaucratic format, Della could see that Una Brightwell had been striking high cheekbones, intense dark eyes, long hair pulled back severely. She looked gaunt, almost haunted, like someone who hadn't been sleeping well. And around her neck, visible even in the small photograph, hung a pendant. Della pulled the wooden wolf carving from her pocket and held it next to the photo. The same. Identical in every detail she could make out. Her heart was hammering now. This woman had vanished 32 years ago, during Della's first full season at Granite Peak, and she'd been carrying the same carved wolf that Della had just dug up from her campsite. She flipped through the rest of the file. Search reports, witness statements, a brief biography. Una had been an anthropologist, apparently, studying indigenous cultures of the Northern Rockies. She'd taken a sabbatical from her university position to conduct field research in the Selkirks. She'd been alone, had told no one her specific research sites, and had vanished without leaving any trace beyond her vehicle. The last page in the file was a handwritten note from the lead ranger on the search. Searched all likely areas within 10-mile radius. Creek dragged, no body found. Subject either left the area under her own power or succumbed to elements in location not yet discovered. Without additional evidence, search suspended. File remains open. Della sat down in the dusty desk chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. She remembered that search. She'd been asked to keep watch from the tower, to report any smoke or unusual activity. She'd seen the search helicopters, had watched them grid the forest for days, and she remembered those strange smoke signals from a few weeks earlier, the ones Tom had investigated and found nothing. What if they'd been connected? What if Una had been making those signals, and by the time anyone investigated, she was already gone? Kerrick whined softly and nosed at her knee. She reached down to pet him, needing the physical contact, the reminder that she wasn't alone in this dusty room full of ghosts. Who was she, boy? And what does she have to do with that wolf? She kept reading through the file, looking for any clue that might explain the connection. Una's research had focused on what she called remnant populations, indigenous groups that had maintained traditional lifeways despite pressure to assimilate. She'd published papers on hunter-gatherer societies, on traditional ecological knowledge, on the relationship between humans and apex predators. There was a quote from one of her papers, printed out and included in the file. The bond between human and wolf predates agriculture, predates civilization as we know it. In that ancient relationship lies wisdom we've forgotten in our rush toward modernity. Della looked at the wooden carving again. Someone had made this with great care, had imbued it with meaning that went beyond simple decoration. And Una had worn it, had carried it into these mountains, had been carrying it when she vanished. The light in the station was fading. She'd been reading longer than she'd realized. She needed to make a decision. She could take the file, hike out, report what she'd found to the authorities. It would take her a day and a half to reach the trailhead, another few hours to drive to the ranger station. By the time anyone could mount a follow-up investigation, whatever trail existed would be even colder than it already was. Or she could keep going. The wolf had led her here deliberately, had made sure she found this information. It hadn't felt threatening this morning. It had felt like an invitation. She looked at the photograph of Una Brightwell one more time. The woman stared back at her across 3 decades, those haunted eyes holding secrets Della was only beginning to guess at. "All right," she said softly. "I'm listening." She closed the file but kept it, sliding it into her pack alongside the wolf carving. Then she did a more thorough search of the station, looking for anything else that might be relevant. In the back room, behind a loose board that she found only because Kerrick kept sniffing at it, she discovered more papers. Photocopies, water-damaged and faded, but still readable. pages torn from a journal covered in handwriting that matched the notes in Una's file. Della carried them to the window, where the light was better, and began to read. The entries were dated July through August of 1993. They described Una's research, her methodology, her findings. But as the dates progressed, the tone changed. The clinical anthropological observations gave way to something more personal, more urgent. July 28. Found evidence of semi-permanent habitation in the upper valley. Stone arrangements, fire pits that show long-term use, not contemporary, but not ancient either. Something in between. August 3. The wolves here behave differently. Pack structure is stable across years, same individuals, same territories. Alpha male shows unusual tolerance for human presence, almost as if he's accustomed to us. August 10. She won't speak to me yet, but she watches. I see her sometimes at dawn, at the edge of the clearing. She's old, maybe 70. How does she survive out here alone? August 15. Her name is Tsula. She says it means fox in a language I don't recognize. Not Nez Perce, not Coeur d'Alene, something older. She says her people have been here longer than trees. I think she means her specific family line, not her tribe. A lineage of watchers. August 22. Tsula gave me this. There was a crude sketch of the wolf carving. She says it marks me as a friend to the pack, says the wolves know who to trust. I don't know if I believe in that kind of thing, but I wear it anyway. It feels important. The final entry was dated August 25, 3 days before Una was reported missing. August 25. Tsula is dying. She knows it. She says someone must keep the watch when she's gone. She says the wolves will choose. I don't understand what that means, but I feel it in my bones. Something is about to change. Something that matters more than my research, more than my career. Tomorrow I'm moving my camp to the upper valley. If anyone reads this, know that I went willingly. Know that I chose this. The entry ended there. Della read it 3 times, trying to parse the meaning. Tsula. A woman living alone in the mountains, dying, talking about wolves and watching. And Una had gone to her, had moved her camp, had apparently chosen something. Chosen what? Outside, the sun was setting, painting the clearing in shades of gold and amber. Della needed to make camp soon, needed to eat and rest, but she felt pulled forward, compelled to keep moving. The wolf appeared then, as if summoned by her thoughts. It stood at the tree line, backlit by the setting sun, waiting. Kerrick stood and walked to the door, looking back at her expectantly. Della shouldered her pack, tucked the journal pages carefully into a waterproof bag, and followed the wolf deeper into the wilderness. They hiked until full dark, following the wolf through terrain that grew progressively more remote. Della's legs ached and her feet throbbed in her boots, but she pushed forward, trusting that the wolf knew where it was leading her. Kerrick stayed close, his presence reassuring as the last light faded from the sky. When the wolf finally stopped, they were in a small clearing beside a creek Della didn't recognize. She'd thought she knew every waterway in this region, but this one was new to her, narrow, swift-moving, singing over smooth stones in the darkness. The wolf looked at her once, then melted into the trees. Della stood alone with Kerrick, listening to the creek and the wind and her own breathing. "Well," she said to the dog, "I guess we're camping here." She set up her tent by headlamp, going through the familiar motions with tired efficiency. No fire tonight, she was too exhausted, and besides, she had a feeling she shouldn't announce her presence any more than necessary. She ate a cold dinner of jerky and trail mix, gave Kerrick his kibble, and crawled into her sleeping bag as soon as the tent was secure. She expected to lie awake, worrying about wolves and missing women and mysterious watchers, but exhaustion claimed her immediately. She dropped into sleep like a stone into deep water. When she woke, the sun was already well up. She'd slept later than usual, her body demanding the rest it needed. Kerrick was sitting at the tent entrance, alert but calm, and when she unzipped the flap, she understood why. The wolf was back. But it wasn't alone. 2 other wolves, sat in the clearing with it, smaller than the black alpha, but still impressive. One was grey, with white markings on its chest, the other a mottled brown. They watched her with the same intelligent attention as the black wolf, and none of them showed any sign of aggression. Della climbed out of the tent slowly, keeping her movements smooth and unthreatening. The wolves didn't react. Kerrick walked forward, and to Della's astonishment touched noses with the grey wolf. The two animals regarded each other for a long moment, then Kerrick's tail began to wag. "I'll be damned," Della whispered. She made breakfast while the wolves watched. It felt surreal, cooking oatmeal with an audience of apex predators, but they seemed content to simply observe. When she was done eating, the black wolf stood and started walking upstream along the creek. Della followed. They hiked for perhaps 3 miles, climbing steadily into higher country. The forest changed as they went, the lodgepole pines giving way to older growth, massive ponderosas and western red cedars that must have been several hundred years old. The understory was different too, lush with ferns and moss, shaded and cool even in the September sun. Then the valley opened up before her, and Della stopped in her tracks. It was hidden. This place ringed by ridges on 3 sides, accessible only through the narrow creek drainage she'd just climbed. Maybe 200 acres of meadow and forest, pristine and untouched, with the creek running through its center. And in the middle of the meadow stood something that made her breath catch. A stone circle. Massive river stones arranged in a perfect ring, maybe 40 feet across, with a larger central stone that stood waist-high. The stones were covered in lichen and moss, clearly ancient, but the arrangement was too deliberate to be natural. The black wolf walked directly to the circle and sat beside the central stone, waiting. Della approached slowly, Kerrick at her side. As she got closer, she could see that the central stone was carved. The wolf symbol was there, prominent on the stone's face, but there were other markings too, symbols she didn't recognize, weathered by time but still visible. She knelt beside the stone, running her fingers over the carvings. This wasn't recent. This was old, genuinely old, predating anything European settlers would have built. The carving technique looked similar to what she'd seen in museums, petroglyphs from indigenous cultures, but the specific symbols were unfamiliar. Looking around the clearing more carefully, she began to notice other signs of long-term human presence. Fire pits, carefully arranged stones that might have been the foundations of temporary shelters, areas where the ground had been worn smooth by repeated use over years or decades. People had lived here, not just passed through, but actually lived here, for a very long time. And then she saw the tents. 2 of them, set up at the far edge of the clearing near a stand of old-growth cedars. One was clearly decades old, the fabric sun-faded and patched, the poles weathered grey. The other looked more recent, maybe 10 or 15 years old, set up with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew what they were doing. Della walked toward them, her heart pounding. The wolves followed but kept their distance, letting her approach alone. The older tent first. She unzipped it carefully and looked inside. Camping gear, organized neatly despite years of deterioration. A sleeping bag, ancient but still functional. Cooking supplies, books, field guides, journals, texts on anthropology and ecology. And in a corner, protected by a waterproof container, more papers. Della pulled out the container and opened it. Inside was a journal, its cover marked with a name, Una Brightwell. She carried it outside and sat in the sun to read. The journal picked up where the photocopied pages had left off. Una had come to this valley, had met Sula, had learned about the stone circle and what it represented. The entries were detailed, written in the careful hand of someone who knew their observations mattered. The 27th of August, 1993. Tazula showed me everything today. This valley is a refuge, has been for generations beyond counting. Her people fled here when the soldiers came, when the reservations were established. They chose to vanish rather than submit. A handful of families, maybe 20 people, who walked away from history and into these mountains. They made a pact with the wolf pack that lived here, mutual protection. The wolves would guard the valley, and the humans would watch from the high places for threats approaching. They built watching posts on the ridges, places where someone could see danger coming from miles away. Over the generations, the families dwindled. People died, children were born, but chose to leave, to rejoin the world their grandparents had fled. Tsula is the last of the blood, but she says the responsibility transcends bloodline. Someone must keep the watch. The wolves need someone to be their eyes in the high places. She asked me to stay. She's dying liver cancer, she thinks, though she's never seen a doctor. She has maybe a year, maybe less. She needs to know someone will continue the watch when she's gone. I told her I'd think about it, but I already know my answer. My career means nothing compared to this. My publications, my tenure track, all of it is just noise. This is real. This matters. The entries continued through the fall and winter of 1993. Una had stayed. She'd learned from Tula how to survive in the wilderness long term, how to read the wolves' behavior, how to maintain the watching posts. The writing showed her transformation from academic observer to full participant. The 15th of January 1994, Tsula died this morning, peacefully, in her sleep, the way she wanted. The wolves gathered at dawn, all 7 of them, and howled for an hour. I've never heard anything like it. Not mourning, exactly. More like acknowledgement. Like they were saying goodbye to someone they'd known their whole lives. I buried her on the ridge overlook, where she asked to be laid. The wolves watched. The whole time, the alpha male, the big black one I call Shadow, came forward after I'd finished and nosed at the stones covering her grave. Then he looked at me, and I swear to God I saw understanding in his eyes. I'm alone now, completely alone, and I've never felt more purposeful in my entire life. Della read through the years 1994, 1995, 1996. Una had lived here, had made this valley her home. She'd maintained a small garden, had hunted and fished, had kept meticulous notes about the wolf pack's behavior and the valley's ecology. She'd been happy. The final entries were from 2023, 27 years after the journal began. The 10th of May, 2023. I'm 69 years old today. I've been here for 30 years, longer than Tsula was, longer than anyone before her that she knew of. The valley has been good to me. The wolves have been good to me. I've watched 3 generations of pups born and raised, have seen the pack maintain its territory and its purpose. But I'm getting old. My hands shake now, and my vision isn't what it was. I can still maintain the camp, still walk the watching posts, but I don't know how many more years I have. Maybe 5, maybe 10, if I'm lucky. The question is the same one Tsula faced. Who comes next? The wolves will keep searching until they find someone. Shadow is old now too, he must be 15, ancient for a wolf. But his bloodline continues. His daughter leads the pack now, and her son, the big black male, who looks so much like his grandfather, has started testing me, watching me, trying to understand if I'm still capable. I think he knows I'm failing. I think he's already looking for my replacement. The final entry was dated August 2023, just 2 years ago. The 30th of August 2023. I know what's coming. My body is telling me in ways I can't ignore anymore. The cancer that took Tsula has found me too. I can feel it, though I don't know exactly where. Liver, maybe, or stomach. Does it matter? I've written a letter for whoever comes next. I've sealed it and left it where the wolves will make sure it's found. If you're reading this journal, if you've followed the wolves to this place, then you already know most of what matters. The valley needs a guardian. The wolves need eyes in the high places. You'll have to choose, just like I did. No one will force you. But know this, there's purpose here. There's meaning. I've lived 30 years in this valley, and they've been the best years of my life. I found what I was looking for, though I didn't know I was looking until I arrived. Trust the wolves. Trust yourself. And if you choose to stay, welcome home. Della closed the journal with trembling hands. Una hadn't vanished. She'd chosen this. She'd lived here for 3 decades, had died here probably in that very tent, and had left everything arranged for whoever came next. And the wolves had gone looking. They'd found Della. She looked at the Black Wolf Shadow's grandson, perhaps sitting by the stone circle, and watching her with those intelligent eyes. "You've been searching for 2 years," she said softly, "looking for someone to keep the watch." The wolf's tail moved slightly, not quite a wag, but acknowledgement. Kerrick leaned against her leg, and Della realized she was crying, not from sadness, but from something larger and harder to name. Recognition, maybe, or relief. She'd spent 5 years since Tom's death, feeling like she'd lost her purpose. And here it was, waiting for her in a hidden valley, offered by wolves who needed human eyes to complete their ancient pact. But she hadn't decided yet. She couldn't decide yet. This was too big, too strange, too far from anything she'd ever imagined. "I need time," she told the wolf. "I need to think." The wolf stood, dipped its head slightly, and walked back into the forest. The other 2 wolves followed, leaving Della alone with Kerrick and an impossible choice. Della spent the rest of the day exploring the valley, trying to understand what exactly she was being asked to accept. The hidden clearing was larger than she'd first realized, at least 300 acres of meadow and forest, all ringed by steep ridges that made it invisible from any trail or lookout point. Someone could live here for years and never be found unless they wanted to be. She walked the perimeter, noting the natural features, the creek that provided fresh water year-round, the meadow that would support a garden, the stands of timber that offered shelter and firewood. On the eastern ridge, she found what Una's journal had mentioned, a watching post, carefully constructed from native stone and positioned to give a clear view of the approaches to the valley. Standing there, looking out over miles of unbroken wilderness, Della felt something click into place. This was what she'd been doing from her fire lookout tower for 30 years, watching, waiting, protecting, just on a different scale, for different reasons. She found 2 more watching posts as the afternoon wore on, each positioned to cover a different approach to the valley. They were old, the stonework weathered and moss-covered, but solid. They'd been maintained recently. Una's work, presumably, continued until she could no longer make the climbs. As sunset approached, Della returned to the stone circle. The second tent, the newer one, had to be explored. She'd been avoiding it, she realized, because opening it would make everything more real. Inside, she found more evidence of recent habitation. The sleeping bag was good quality, modern. The camping stove was a model from maybe 5 years ago, and there were supplies, canned goods, dried beans, rice, coffee. Enough for several months if carefully rationed. But what caught her attention was the wooden box in the corner, sealed with wax to keep out moisture. She opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, just as Una's journal had promised. The envelope was addressed simply, "To she who follows the wolf." Della's hands shook as she opened it. "Dear friend," it began, in handwriting that matched the journal. "If you're reading this, then Shadow's bloodline has found you, and you've followed them here. That means something. The wolves don't choose randomly, they never have. They look for certain qualities, certain ways of being in the world. Patience, watchfulness, the ability to be alone without being lonely. I don't know who you are, but I know you've spent time in wild places. I know you understand what it means to watch and wait. And I know you've reached a point in your life where you're searching for something, even if you can't name it yet. I found that something here. I found purpose, meaning, a sense of belonging to something larger than myself. For 30 years I've kept the watch that Sula kept before me, that others kept before her, going back generations. I've protected this valley and the pack that calls it home. And I've been happy, genuinely, deeply happy in ways I never was in my old life. But I'm gone now. The cancer I suspected in my last journal entry took me about a year after that writing. I had time to prepare, time to make sure everything was ready for whoever came next. The wolves were with me at the end, which is all I could have asked for. You have a choice to make, and it needs to be yours alone. No one will force you to stay. No one will judge you if you leave. But if you choose to accept this guardianship, here's what it means. The valley needs protection. Not from animals, they take care of themselves, but from people, poachers, developers, anyone who would exploit or destroy this place. Your job is to watch, to warn the pack of approaching danger, and to intervene when necessary. You don't have to stay year-round. Sula told me that the early guardians would spend the growing season here and winter with their families. That balance is important. This calling shouldn't cut you off from the world entirely. The wolves will teach you what you need to know. They'll show you their patterns, their territory, their ways of communicating. Trust them. They've been doing this longer than any human can remember. There's a cabin on the far side of the valley, hidden in the cedar grove. I built it myself over the years, nothing fancy, but solid and dry. You'll find journals there from previous guardians, going back more than a century. Read them, learn from them, add your own story to theirs. If you choose this, you'll be joining something ancient and important. You'll be part of a chain of watchers that stretches back beyond recorded history. That's not a small thing. But if you choose to leave, that's okay too. The wolves will keep searching. They're patient. They'll find someone else eventually. Either way, thank you for following them this far. Thank you for being open to something strange and wonderful. And thank you for reading an old woman's ramblings. The valley is waiting. The wolves are waiting. The choice, as always, is yours. With hope and gratitude, Una Brightwell. Della read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and returned it to its box. Her mind was spinning with questions, objections, practical concerns. She was 62 years old. Her children needed her, or thought they did. She had a condo, responsibilities, a life. But did she? Really? Linda and Marcus were busy with their own families, their own careers. They called her once a week out of duty, more than need. Her grandchildren were teenagers, now more interested in their phones than their grandmother's stories. The condo was just a place to store things and collect mail. Her life, such as it was, consisted of waiting for the next hiking trip, the next chance to feel like herself. And here was someone offering her exactly what she'd been longing for, without knowing it purpose, meaning, a reason to wake up each morning that went beyond filling the hours until sleep came again. But could she really do this? Live in the wilderness for months at a time, cut off from civilization, responsible for protecting something that most people didn't even know existed? She walked to the stone circle and sat with her back against the central stone. Kerrick settled beside her, resting his head on her lap. The sun was setting now, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber. A pair of hawks circled overhead, riding the thermal currents. The creek sang its constant song. The black wolf emerged from the tree line, followed by 4 others. They arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around the stone, watching her but giving her space, not threatening, just present, waiting for her decision. "I had a husband once," Della said to them, her voice carrying across the clearing. "His name was Tom. He died 5 years ago, heart attack, sudden, no warning. He was a ranger, spent his whole life in these mountains. He would have loved this place, would have understood it immediately." The wolves listened, their ears forward, their attention complete. "Before he died, he told me that I was born to watch over things. Said it was in my bones, the way music was in some people's bones or math was in others. He said I had a gift for seeing patterns, for noticing when something was wrong before anyone else did. That's why I was good at fire lookout work. I could read the mountains." Kerrick whined softly, and she stroked his head. "But after he died, I didn't know what I was watching for anymore. The Forest Service retired me, gave me a party and a plaque, and suddenly I was supposed to be done. Supposed to be happy living in a condo and taking up hobbies and waiting for grandchildren to visit. She looked at the black wolf. You know that's not enough, don't you? You've been watching me, testing me. You knew before I did that I needed this. The wolf's tail moved slightly, that same, almost acknowledgement she'd seen before. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm 62 years old, and you're asking me to live in the wilderness and protect a valley from threats I can't even imagine yet. That's insane. That's not what normal people do at my age. But even as she said it, she knew the truth. She'd never been normal. She'd spent 30 years alone on a mountaintop, had married a man who understood that she needed space to breathe, had been happiest when she was watching over something larger than herself. This was what she'd been preparing for her entire life. She just hadn't known it. Until now. I need to see the cabin, she said. I need to read those journals. And then I need one night to sleep on it. Can you give me that? The black wolf stood, turned, and started walking toward the cedar grove on the valley's far side. The other wolves fell in behind him, and Kerrick stood up expectantly. Della shouldered her pack and followed them toward whatever came next. The cabin was exactly where Una's letter had said it would be, tucked into a grove of ancient western red cedars, invisible until you were almost upon it. It was small, maybe 12 by 16 feet, but beautifully constructed from hand-hewn logs chinked with moss and clay. The roof was cedar shakes, weathered silver grey, and a stone chimney rose from one end. Della pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was simple, but thoughtfully arranged. A narrow bed with a real mattress, she had no idea how Una had gotten it up here, a wood stove for heat and cooking, shelves lined with supplies and books, a small table with 2 chairs, and a window that looked out over the valley. The floor was packed earth, swept clean, and the whole space smelled of cedar and wood smoke. But what drew her attention were the journals. They lined an entire shelf, maybe 30 or 40 volumes, leather-bound and carefully labeled with dates. The earliest was marked 1897 to 1902. The most recent was Una's, dated 2023. Between them stretched more than a century of guardianship, recorded in careful handwriting by people whose names she didn't know. Della pulled down the oldest journal and opened it carefully. My name is Elijah Thornton, it began. I am 43 years old, a trapper by trade, and I have been living in this valley for 5 years now. I write this account so that whoever comes after me will understand what I could not when I first arrived, that some responsibilities choose us, not the other way around. She read by lamplight as darkness fell outside. Elijah's story was similar to Una's in many ways. He'd been following trap lines when he'd encountered the wolves, had been led to the valley, had met an old woman named Silver Moon who was dying and needed someone to continue the watch. Silver Moon told me her people had been here for more generations than she could count, Elijah wrote. They called themselves the Keepers, though she said that was a rough translation. Their purpose was simple: watch over the sacred places, protect them from those who would destroy them, and maintain the old pacts with the animal nations. The wolf pack was their closest ally. The wolves guarded the valley itself, while the humans watched from the high places, warning of danger approaching from afar. It was a partnership, she said, as old as the mountains themselves. She asked me to stay, and I agreed. That was 5 years ago. I have kept the watch ever since, and I have never regretted my choice. This valley has given me more peace than I ever found in Mormont. Civilization. Della skipped forward in Elijah's journals, reading about his daily life, hunting and fishing, maintaining the watching posts, learning the wolves' language of howls and body postures. He'd lived here for 32 years before his final entry, dated 1929, explained that he was ill and knew his time was short. The wolves have found someone, he wrote in a shaking hand. A woman who fled an abusive husband, came to these mountains to escape or die. The pack led her here 3 days ago. Her name is Anna, and she is young and strong and frightened. But I see something in her eyes, the same thing Silver Moon must have seen in me. The capacity to watch, the need for purpose. I have told her everything. Tomorrow I will show her the watching posts, and then my work will be done. The chain continues. The watch goes on. Della pulled down Anna's journal next. The handwriting was shakier at first, less confident, but it steadied as the years progressed. Anna had kept the watch for 41 years, from 1929 to 1970, and her entries showed the same pattern: initial uncertainty, giving way to deep commitment and satisfaction. There were others too. Michael, who'd been a forest ranger before finding the valley in 1970. Sophia, who'd been a wildlife biologist and arrived in 1988. Each guardian had stayed for decades, had found meaning and purpose in this strange calling, and had carefully prepared the way for whoever came next. And now, it was her turn. Della Rusk, 62 years old, retired fire lookout, widow, mother, grandmother, being asked to join a chain of watchers that stretched back more than a century. She put the journals away carefully and stepped outside. The night was clear, stars blazing overhead in the way they only did in true wilderness. The wolves were nearby. She could hear them moving in the underbrush, settling in for the night. Kerrick stood beside her, looking up at her face as if trying to read her thoughts. "What do you think, boy?" she asked him. "Are we crazy for even considering this?" Kerrick's tail wagged once, slowly. He walked to the cabin door and looked back at her expectantly. Ready to go inside, ready to settle in, ready to stay. "You've already decided, haven't you?" She scratched his ears. "You knew before I did. That's why you bonded with that wolf so quickly. You understood what this was about." She thought about Tom then, really allowed herself to remember him. Not the loss of him, not the grief, but the man himself, his laugh, his hands, the way he'd understood her need for solitude without taking it personally. He'd always said she was meant for something unusual, that her talent for watching and waiting was too specific to be an accident. If he were here now, what would he say? She knew the answer immediately. He'd tell her to trust her instincts. He'd tell her that opportunities like this didn't come along often, that most people spent their whole lives searching for the kind of purpose being offered to her right now. He'd tell her to stop overthinking and start feeling, and when she did that, when she stopped listing objections and just felt the answer was clear, she wanted this, wanted it with an intensity that surprised her. The valley, the wolves, the watching posts, the cabin, all of it called to something deep in her bones. This was right. This was what she'd been moving toward her entire life without knowing it. But there were practical concerns. Her children, her responsibilities, her life outside these mountains. She couldn't just vanish the way Una had. That wouldn't be fair to Linda and Marcus, wouldn't be right. She'd have to find a balance. Una's letter had mentioned it. The early guardians spent the growing season in the valley and wintered with their families. She could do that. April through October here, November through March with her children and grandchildren. They'd worry at first, but they'd adjust. And she'd be honest with them, or as honest as she could be without sounding completely insane. She'd tell them she'd found a seasonal position as a volunteer wilderness caretaker. That wasn't even really a lie, it was just missing some crucial details about wolves and ancient pacts and stone circles. They didn't need to know everything. They just needed to know she was okay, that she'd found something meaningful to do with her retirement. The black wolf appeared at the edge of the clearing, watching her. She met its eyes and held them. "I need to go back," she told it. "Down to my truck, back to civilization for a few days. I need to arrange things, talk to my kids, get more supplies. But I'll come back. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing the watch." The wolf's tail moved, definitely a wag this time, slow and deliberate. Understanding. "Give me a week," she said. "I'll be back in a week, and then I'll stay through October. I'll learn what you need to teach me. And next April, I'll come back for the full season." The wolf dipped its head, that same gesture of acknowledgement she'd seen before, and disappeared into the darkness. Della looked up at the stars, feeling something she hadn't felt since before Tom died. Not just peace, but purpose. direction, a reason to wake up tomorrow that went beyond simply getting through another day. She was 62 years old, and she was about to become the guardian of a hidden valley and partner to a wolf pack. It was insane. It was perfect. It was exactly what she needed. She went inside the cabin, lay down on the bed, which was surprisingly comfortable, and fell asleep immediately. Kerrick curled up on the floor beside her. For the first time in 5 years, she didn't dream about Tom dying. She dreamed about watching posts and wolf howls and mountains that went on forever. Morning came with the sound of wolves howling, a chorus that echoed across the valley and seemed to celebrate something Della couldn't quite name. She woke feeling more rested than she had in years. Her body relaxed in a way that had nothing to do with the comfort of the bed and everything to do with the decision she'd made. She spent the morning walking the valley one more time, memorizing its features, understanding what she'd be protecting. The stone circle, the watching posts, the creek with its clear, cold water, the meadow where wildflowers still bloomed despite the lateness of the season. It was beautiful in a way that went beyond simple aesthetics. It had presence, weight, significance that she could feel but not quite articulate. Around noon, as she was preparing to hike back to her original campsite and then out to her truck, she noticed something she'd missed before. Near Una's tent, partially hidden by tall grass, was a small stone cairn. Della approached it slowly, recognizing it for what it was, a grave marker. The stones were carefully arranged, and someone had carved words into a flat piece of wood and placed it at the cairn's base, protected by a layer of clear resin. Una Brightwell, 1946 to 2023. She kept the watch. So Una had died here, as her journal suggested, and someone had buried her. The wolves? That seemed impossible, but then again, everything about this situation seemed impossible. Maybe another hiker had stumbled upon her body and done the respectful thing. Or maybe her thoughts were interrupted by a sound that didn't belong. Distant, but distinct, the crack of a rifle shot, echoing across the ridges from somewhere north of the valley. Della's blood went cold. Gunshots weren't uncommon in the wilderness during hunting season, but this was wrong, too close to the valley, too close to the hidden places that needed protection. The wolves materialized around her, moving fast and silent, their body language completely changed from the calm watchfulness she'd observed before. They were agitated, alarmed, and the black alpha was staring at the northern ridge with ears flat against his skull. Another shot, closer this time. Then voices male, rough, carrying through the thin mountain air. Della grabbed her pack and moved quickly toward the northern watching post, the wolves following. Kerrick stayed close to her side, no longer the friendly companion, but alert and ready. When she reached the vantage point, she pulled out her binoculars and scanned the approach to the valley. 3 men, maybe half a mile out, moving through the forest with rifles and heavy packs. As she watched, one of them stopped to examine something on the ground tracks, probably wolf tracks. They were hunters. No, worse, they were poachers. Real hunters didn't operate like this, didn't move with this kind of focused intensity toward a specific target. These men were tracking the wolf pack deliberately, following them toward their den, toward the valley. Della's mind raced. She'd made her decision to become guardian less than 12 hours ago, and already she was being tested. What was she supposed to do? She had no authority here, no legal standing to stop anyone from doing anything. She was just a retired fire lookout with a dog and a pack full of camping gear. But she'd promised. She'd told the wolf she would keep the watch, would protect the valley and the pack that called it home. The men were getting closer. One of them stopped again, pointing toward the creek drainage, the same route Della had used to enter the valley. They'd found the trail. In another hour, maybe less, they'd discover the hidden entrance. She pulled out her emergency whistle, the kind that could be heard for miles, and blew 3 sharp blasts. The universal signal for distress. Maybe there were other hikers in the area, maybe a ranger on patrol. It was a long shot, but she had to try. The men heard it. She saw them stop, conference briefly, then continue forward with renewed caution. They knew someone else was in the area now, but they weren't deterred. Della looked at the wolves. The black alpha was watching her, waiting to see what she would do. This was the moment, the real choice, not the philosophical decision she'd made last night in the comfort of the cabin. This was immediate, dangerous, and entirely real. She could leave, could hike out the back way, report this to the authorities when she reached civilization. By the time anyone responded, the poachers would be long gone. They might find the valley, might not. The wolves would survive. They were survivors by nature. Or she could stay, could position herself between the poachers and the valley, use her presence as a barrier, and hope that was enough. Tom's voice echoed in her memory, something he'd told her years ago after she'd confronted a careless camper who'd been leaving trash everywhere. People respect authority. Dell, even when you don't have any official authority, if you act like you do, most of them will back down. She made her decision. Stay here, she told Kerrick and the wolves. Let me try this my way first. She hiked down from the watching post toward the creek drainage, positioning herself at the narrowest point of the approach, a spot where anyone trying to reach the valley would have to pass directly by her. She planted her hiking poles in the ground, shouldered her pack, and waited. The men appeared 20 minutes later. 3 of them, just as she'd counted from above. 30s or early 40s, wearing expensive hunting gear, carrying rifles that probably cost more than her truck. They stopped when they saw her, surprised to encounter anyone this far into the backcountry. Afternoon, the lead man said. He had a careful smile, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. Didn't expect to see anyone out here. Afternoon, Della replied, keeping her voice steady and authoritative. This area is close to hunting. You'll need to turn back. The man's smile faltered. We're not hunting, just hiking. Scenic route. With rifles and 3 days' worth of gear? Della raised an eyebrow. I spent 30 years with the Forest Service. I know what hunting parties look like. That was mostly true. She'd worked for the Forest Service, just not as a ranger with enforcement authority. But these men didn't need to know the specifics of her job description. Look, lady, the second man said, his tone less friendly. We're not bothering anyone. We're just passing through. Not this way, you're not. Della didn't move from her position, blocking the trail. There's a wolf denning area ahead, protected species. If you're found in that area with weapons, that's federal charges. Also mostly true, though she had no idea if wolves were actually denning in the valley right now. But the threat was real enough. Killing wolves could indeed bring federal charges, and these men knew it. The third man, who'd been quiet until now, studied her carefully. You're alone out here. No radio, no backup. You're not a ranger anymore, are you? You're just some retired lady trying to play hero. Della's heart hammered, but she kept her face calm. You're right. I'm retired, but I still have my Forest Service ID. And I've already photographed your faces and your vehicle. Complete bluff. She hadn't seen their vehicle. The rangers know I'm out here, and they know I was concerned about poaching activity in this sector. When I report your presence here with weapons, they'll investigate. You want that kind of attention? The men exchanged glances. The first one, the leader, was calculating odds, trying to decide if she was bluffing. Della pushed her advantage. You came here tracking wolves. I know it, you know it. But what you don't know is that this pack is part of an ongoing wildlife study. They're tagged, monitored, worth more to researchers alive than they'll ever be to you as trophies. Kill one of them, and you'll have every wildlife organization in the state on your back. Another bluff, but a good one. The men shifted uncomfortably. We weren't going to kill anything, the leader finally said. Just wanted to see them up close, photos maybe, with high-powered rifles. Della didn't bother hiding her skepticism. Right. Well, you've seen enough. Time to head back the way you came. The second man took a step forward, trying to intimidate her with his size. And if we don't? This was the moment. If they called her bluff, if they decided to push past her, she had no real way to stop them. She was one older woman with a hiking pole against 3 armed men, but she'd learned something in 30 years of fire lookout work. Most people, when confronted with absolute certainty, will back down. Doubt is what emboldens them. Certainty is what stops them. "Then I document everything," she said quietly, meeting the man's eyes without flinching. "And when the rangers investigate, and they will investigate, you'll be explaining why you threatened a federal employee doing her job. That's assault. That's a felony. That's prison time. Is your ego worth that?" The bluff about being a federal employee was pushing it, but she delivered it with complete confidence, and that's what mattered. The leader put a hand on his companion's arm. "Come on. This isn't worth it. There's other areas, other packs." "But," I said, "come on." His voice was firm now, the voice of someone cutting his losses. The 3 men turned and started back down the trail. Della stood her ground, watching them go, not moving until they disappeared from sight. Even then, she waited another 10 minutes, making sure they weren't circling back. Only when she was certain they were truly gone did she allow herself to collapse against a tree, her legs suddenly weak with released adrenaline. The black wolf appeared beside her, moving so quietly she hadn't heard him approach. He sat down and looked at her, and she could have sworn there was approval in his eyes. "That was terrifying," she told him. "I've never done anything like that before." But even as she said it, she knew it was a lie. She'd done exactly that kind of thing dozens of times, from her lookout tower, called in threats, protected the forest from carelessness and greed, stood between what was precious and what was dangerous. This was just the same work on a different scale. She stood up, her legs steadier now, and looked toward the hidden valley beyond the trees. "I need to learn the watching posts better," she said. "Need to understand all the approaches, all the vulnerable points. If those men come back, or if others come, I need to see them before they see me." The wolf stood and started walking back toward the valley. Della and Kerrick followed. The watch had truly begun. Della spent the next 3 days studying the valley's defenses with the intensity of someone planning a military campaign. The black wolf, she'd started thinking of him as Shadow, after Una's name for his grandfather, led her to every watching post, every vantage point, every approach that someone might use to reach the hidden clearing. There were 5 main entry points, she discovered. The creek drainage she'd used was the most obvious, but there were also 2 ridge routes from the north and east, and 2 more difficult approaches through slot canyons on the south and west sides. Each had its advantages and vulnerabilities, and Della mapped them all in her notebook, using the topographical knowledge she'd accumulated over 3 decades. The watching posts were positioned to cover all approaches, and she understood now why they'd been built where they were. From each stone platform you could see for miles, could spot movement long before anyone reached the valley itself. The early guardians had chosen their positions with military precision. But she also realized how vulnerable a single person was. Una had managed it, but Una had been younger, stronger, and had decades of experience. Della was 62, recovering from the confrontation with the poachers and trying to compress years of learning into a few days. The wolves helped. Shadow stayed close, and gradually the rest of the pack, 7 in total, began treating her as part of their group. They'd appear when she was at the watching posts, would alert her to sounds or movements she'd missed, would position themselves strategically when she was at vulnerable points. Kerrick integrated seamlessly into the pack. She watched him run with the younger wolves, saw him communicating through postures and small sounds that she was only beginning to understand. He was happier than she'd ever seen him, as if he'd finally found the purpose the search and rescue program had tried and failed to give him. On the 4th day, Della hiked back to her original campsite to retrieve the rest of her gear and begin the journey back to her truck. She needed to return to civilization, needed to set things in motion for her new life. But leaving the valley felt wrong, like abandoning a post. Shadow walked with her to the edge of the valley. then stopped and watched as she continued down the mountain. His message was clear. This was temporary. She would return. The hike out took her a day and a half, and with each mile, the modern world felt more alien. When she finally reached her truck at the trailhead, the sight of it, metal and glass and gasoline, seemed jarring after days of stone and wood and water. She drove to Coeur d'Alene in a daze, her mind still in the valley, still processing everything that had happened. The condo felt claustrophobic when she opened the door, the walls too close, the air too stale. She showered, ate real food, and called Linda. "Mom, finally! I've been worried. You didn't call when you got back from your last trip." "I know, honey, I'm sorry. I've been doing a lot of thinking." "About?" Della took a breath. "I've been offered a position. Volunteer wilderness caretaker for a private conservation project up in the Selkirks. Seasonal work, April through October. Living on site, monitoring wildlife, maintaining trails, that sort of thing." There was a long pause. "Mom, you're 62 years old. Living alone in the wilderness for 6 months at a time, is that really safe?" "I've been doing exactly that for 30 years, Linda. This is just making it official. But that was your job. You had support, communication, equipment, regular check-ins. This sounds like, I don't know, like you're running away from something." Della closed her eyes. "Maybe I am. Or maybe I'm running toward something. I've been lost since your dad died, sweetheart. You know that. The condo, the routine, the waiting for grandkids to visit, it's not enough. I need purpose. You have purpose. You're a grandmother. You're my mom. And I'll still be those things. I'll spend winters here, November through March. We'll have more time together than we do now, actually. But the rest of the year, I need to be in the mountains. I need to be useful." Another long pause. Then quietly, "Does this make you happy?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. "Happier than I've been since your dad died." "Then okay. I don't understand it, but okay. Just promise me you'll check in regularly. And if it gets to be too much, you'll come home." "I promise." They talked for another hour, working out logistics. Linda would keep an eye on the condo, would be Della's emergency contact, would receive weekly check-ins via satellite communicator that Della would need to purchase. Marcus took more convincing when Della called him next, but eventually he agreed, on the condition that he could visit at least once during the season. The next few days were a blur of preparation. Della bought better camping equipment, a satellite communicator with emergency beacon, more supplies than she could carry in one trip. She'd need to make multiple supply runs to the valley, caching food and gear for the long season ahead. She also went to the library and checked out every book she could find on wolf behavior, wilderness survival, and traditional ecological knowledge. If she was going to be a guardian, she needed to truly understand what she was protecting. A week after leaving the valley, she was ready to return. Her truck was loaded with supplies, her children were notified, and her affairs were arranged. She'd written a letter sealed and left with her lawyer explaining everything, to be opened only if something happened to her. She owed someone the full truth, even if they'd only learn it after she was gone. The drive back to the trailhead took 4 hours. She parked in the same spot, loaded her pack with the first supply run, and started hiking. This time, she knew where she was going. The terrain was familiar now, and she moved with purpose rather than uncertainty. Kerrick ranged ahead, clearly eager to return to the pack. They reached the valley in 2 days, and Shadow was waiting at the entrance to the creek drainage. He stood when he saw her, his tail wagging in clear welcome, and led her back to the hidden clearing. The cabin felt like home. She unpacked her supplies, organized the space, and spent the evening reading more of the Guardian journals by lamplight. Each previous watcher had left wisdom she could learn from practical advice about maintaining the watching posts, understanding wolf behavior, managing supplies through long seasons. But they'd also left something else, a sense of continuity, of being part of something that stretched across generations. She wasn't alone in this strange calling. She was joining a tradition, adding her link to a chain that went back further than she could fully trace. That night, the pack gathered in the meadow outside the cabin. All 7 wolves, plus Kerrick, sitting in a loose circle. Shadow howled, a long, rising note that echoed across the valley, and one by one the others joined in a chorus that raised the hair on Della's arms. She understood what this was. It was welcome. It was acknowledgement. It was the pack's way of saying she belonged here now. On impulse, she stepped outside and howled with them. Her voice was rusty, unpracticed, but the wolves didn't seem to care. They howled together, human and wolf, joined in a song that was older than words. When the howling stopped, Shadow approached her. He was huge, she'd forgotten just how massive, but his posture was gentle. He touched his nose to her hand, the same greeting he'd given Kerrick days before, and Della felt something shift inside her chest. This was real. This was happening. She was a guardian now, part of a partnership that had protected this place for generations. The next morning, she began her education in earnest. Shadow led her on a patrol of the territory, showing her the pack's boundaries, their preferred hunting areas, their den sites. She learned to read their tracks in the soft earth, to understand their vocalizations, to recognize the subtle signs of tension or contentment in their body language. She spent hours at each watching post, memorizing sightlines, understanding how the light changed throughout the day, learning to distinguish between normal forest sounds and the ones that signaled approaching danger. She practiced moving quietly through the woods, covering ground efficiently and positioning herself to observe without being observed. Skills she'd thought she had from her fire lookout days, but which needed refinement for this new role. And she learned the valley itself, every creek, every meadow, every stand of old-growth timber. She learned where the elk herds came through in the evening, where the bears fished in the early morning, where the eagles nested in the tallest pines. 2 weeks passed in intensive study, then 3. September gave way to October, the aspens turning gold on the ridges, the nights getting colder. Della felt herself changing too, becoming leaner, stronger, more attuned to the rhythms of the wild. She was at the northern watching post one afternoon, scanning the approaches out of habit, when she saw movement that made her reach for her binoculars. Men. 3 of them. The same 3 who'd tried to enter the valley before. They were back, and this time they were being careful, moving slowly, watching for any sign of human presence, taking a different route that approached from a blind spot she hadn't adequately covered. Della's heart sank. She'd hoped they'd given up, had convinced themselves the wolves weren't worth the trouble. But poachers were often persistent, especially when they felt they'd been embarrassed or denied. She needed to stop them again. But this time, they'd be expecting resistance. This time, they might not back down. She looked at Shadow, who'd accompanied her to the watching post. The wolf's body was tense, his eyes fixed on the approaching men. "We have to protect the valley," she told him, "whatever it takes." Shadow's lips pulled back. From his teeth, not quite a snarl, but close. He understood. The pack's territory was being threatened, and threats needed to be dealt with. Della checked her satellite communicator. No signal here, the ridges blocked it. She'd need to get to higher ground to call for help, but that would take at least an hour, and by then the poachers would be at the valley entrance. She was on her own. Again. But this time, she wasn't just one woman with a hiking pole and a good bluff. This time, she had the wolves. "All right," she said quietly. "Let's show them what guardianship really means." She started down from the watching post, moving quickly but carefully, Shadow at her side. They had maybe 30 minutes before the poachers reached the valley entrance. 30 minutes to set up a defense that would drive them away for good. The real test was beginning. Della reached the northern valley entrance with 10 minutes to spare. She could hear the poachers now, their voices carrying through the thin October air, confident and careless. They thought they were alone. Thought they'd outsmarted the old woman who'd confronted them before. They were about to learn otherwise. Shadow had disappeared into the trees, moving to gather the pack. Della positioned herself at the narrow choke point where the trail entered the valley, the same spot she'd used before, but this time she had a plan. She pulled out items from her pack: the emergency whistle, her headlamp, her bear spray, and the small air horn she'd brought for scaring off aggressive wildlife. Not weapons exactly, but tools that could create confusion and fear in the right circumstances. The men appeared around the bend, 3 of them, just as before, carrying rifles and moving with the cocky assurance of people who thought they'd figured out the opposition. They stopped when they saw her, surprise flickering across their faces before hardening into annoyance. "You again," the leader said. He didn't smile this time. "We figured you'd given up and gone home." "I live here now," Della said calmly. "I'm the official caretaker for this conservation area. You're trespassing on protected land." "Protected by who? One old lady?" The second man laughed. "We checked after last time. There's no conservation project registered here, no legal protection at all. You lied to us." Della's stomach tightened, but she kept her face neutral. They'd done their research, had called her bluff. That complicated things considerably. "Doesn't matter," she said. "This is still private property, and you're not welcome here." "Private property in the middle of national forest?" The third man shook his head. "That's not how this works. We have as much right to be here as you do." The leader stepped closer, his rifle held casually but present. "Look, we don't want trouble. We just want to see the wolves. Maybe take a trophy, if the opportunity presents itself. You can't stop us, and we both know it. So why don't you just step aside and let us pass?" This was the moment. Della could back down, could let them enter the valley and hope for the best. The wolves would probably survive. They were smart, wary of humans, capable of disappearing into the wilderness. But the valley itself would be compromised. These men would tell others, and soon the hidden place would be overrun with hunters and photographers and curiosity seekers. The ancient refuge would be destroyed by exposure. She couldn't allow that. "No," she said simply. The second man's expression darkened. "Listen, lady." That's when Shadow stepped out of the trees. The black wolf materialized from the shadows like something conjured from nightmare, massive and dark and completely silent. He positioned himself beside Della, his shoulder level with her hip, his yellow eyes fixed on the 3 men with predatory intensity. The men froze. Rifles came up, not quite aimed but ready. "Don't," Della said sharply. "That's a protected species. You shoot that wolf, and it's federal charges regardless of what land we're on." "It's threatening us," the leader said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "He's standing beside me. That's not threatening. That's warning. There's a difference." 2 more wolves emerged from the forest, the grey female and the brown male. They took positions flanking Shadow, creating a line of predators between the men and the valley entrance. "What the hell is this?" the third man whispered. "Wolves don't do this. They don't work with people." "These ones do," Della said. "They've been protecting this valley for generations. And they've decided I'm part of the pack now." 4 more wolves appeared, completing the pack. 7 wolves and 1 German shepherd, all standing together, all focused on the 3 intruders with unwavering attention. The poachers backed up a step, then another. Their rifles were up now, but their hands shook. 7 wolves against 3 men, the math wasn't in their favor, especially not in close quarters where rifles would be clumsy and wolves would be devastatingly effective. "This is insane," the leader said. "Wolves don't. This isn't natural." "You're right," Della agreed. "It's not natural. It's ancient. It's a partnership that existed before your ancestors came to this continent, and it's telling you, very clearly, that you need to leave." Shadow took 1 step forward. The grey female did the same. The line of wolves advanced, slowly, deliberately, pushing the men back. "Last chance," Della said. "Leave now, peacefully, and don't come back." or stay and see what happens when you threaten a wolf pack's territory. The leader looked at his companions, saw the fear in their faces, and made the smart choice. All right, we're leaving, but this isn't over. We'll report this. Report what? That you were trespassing with intent to poach protected wildlife and got scared away by wolves. Good luck with that. Della's voice was hard now, all pretense of politeness gone. Go, now. The men turned and retreated, walking backward at first, keeping their eyes on the wolves, then turning and moving faster once they were around the bend. Della and the pack followed, maintaining pressure, driving them further and further from the valley. They pursued the poachers for nearly 2 miles, the wolves maintaining a loose formation that kept the men moving without quite panicking them into doing something stupid. Della stayed back, letting the pack do what they did best, applying pressure, communicating threat through presence rather than violence. When they reached a point where the trail forked one branch leading back to the trailhead, the other, deeper into the wilderness, Shadow stopped. The men took the trailhead branch, practically running now, their earlier confidence completely shattered. Della pulled out Tom's old compass from her pocket, the brass warm from being close to her body, and checked their position. They were well outside the valley's immediate territory now, far enough that the men would have to make a deliberate choice to return rather than stumbling back accidentally. She looked at Shadow. Think they'll come back? The wolf's tail moved slightly, his version of a shrug perhaps, maybe yes, maybe no. But they'd been warned twice now, had seen that the valley had defenders who wouldn't back down. Most people, when confronted with that kind of resistance, found easier targets. The pack turned and began the journey back to the valley, moving at a comfortable lope. Della followed at her own pace, her legs tired but her spirits high. She'd done it. She'd protected the valley, not through violence or legal authority, but through partnership and determination. The sun was setting by the time they reached the hidden clearing. The stone circle glowed amber in the fading light, and the cabin looked warm and welcoming in its grove of cedars. Della built a fire in the wood stove, made dinner from her supplies, and sat at the small table to write her first entry in her Guardian journal. The 15th of October 2025, she began, her handwriting steady despite her tired hand. My name is Della Rusk. I'm 62 years old, a retired fire lookout, a widow, a mother, and a grandmother. 2 weeks ago, I became the guardian of this valley and partner to the wolf pack that calls it home. Today I faced my first real test. Poachers returned, determined to enter the valley despite being warned away once before. I had no legal authority to stop them, no official standing to cite, no backup to call. All I had was my commitment to protect this place and the trust of the wolves. It was enough. Shadow and the pack stood with me, created a barrier that the poachers couldn't cross without violence, and drove them away from the valley. I don't know if they'll return. I don't know if others will come. But I know that I'll be here, watching and ready, for as long as I'm needed. Una was right about everything. This calling is strange and demanding, but it's also deeply satisfying in ways I couldn't have imagined. I've found purpose again. I've found a place where my skills and my instincts matter, where I can make a real difference. Tom would have understood. He always said I was meant to watch over things. I just didn't know the scope of what that meant until now. She paused, looking out the window at the pack, settling in for the night around the clearing. Kerrick was with them, fully integrated now, indistinguishable from the wolves except for his slightly different build. I've joined something ancient today, she continued writing. A chain of watchers stretching back generations, people who chose to protect what was precious rather than exploit it. I don't know how long I'll be able to keep this watch. I'm not young, and the work is demanding, but I'll do it as long as I can. And when my time comes, I'll make sure someone else is ready to continue. The valley is safe tonight. The pack is safe. The watch goes on. She signed her name, closed the journal, and added it to the shelf beside the others. Her story was now part of the record, her commitment documented for whoever came after. Outside, Shadow howled, a long, rising note that spoke of territory defended, pack intact, balance maintained. The others joined in, and Della found herself smiling. She stepped outside into the cold October night and looked up at the stars, brilliant and countless overhead. The same stars the ancient guardians had seen, the same stars that Una had watched during her 30 years here. "I'm home," she said softly to the night, to the mountains, to Tom's memory. And she was. Not in the condo with its careful furniture and its empty rooms, but here in a hidden valley, with wolves for companions and purpose for sustenance. She'd spent 5 years searching for this feeling, and now that she'd found it, she understood what she'd been missing all along. Not comfort, not safety, not the easy retirement everyone expected her to want. Purpose, meaning. The knowledge that her presence mattered, that her watchfulness protected something irreplaceable. She was 62 years old, and her real life, the life she was meant for, had just begun. Shadow appeared beside her, his dark fur almost invisible in the night. He sat, and she rested her hand on his head, feeling the warmth of him, the solid reality of their partnership. "Thank you," she told him, "for finding me, for choosing me, for trusting me with this." The wolf leaned against her leg, and they stood together under the stars, guardian and wolf, watching over the valley that was now their shared responsibility. The watch continued, as it always had, as it always would. 3 weeks later, with November approaching and the first real snow beginning to fall, Della prepared to leave the valley for the winter. She'd spent the time reinforcing her knowledge, committing every detail to memory, making sure the cabin was secure and supplied for her return in April. The pack seemed to understand what was happening. They'd become quieter, more attentive, spending more time near the cabin, as if wanting to memorize her presence just as she'd memorized theirs. On her last morning in the valley, Della walked to each watching post one final time. The northern post, where she'd first confronted the poachers. The eastern post with its view of 3 ridges and the valley below. The southern post where the aspens grew thick and golden even under the new snow. At each one, she said a quiet goodbye, promising to return, committing the views to memory to sustain her through the winter months in civilization. Back at the cabin, she packed carefully, leaving most of her supplies for next season, but taking what she'd need to reassure her children she was healthy and whole. The Guardian journal she left on their shelf, but she tucked her own journal, now containing entries covering the entire fall, into her pack. She'd continue writing through the winter, documenting her thoughts and preparations for the next season. Shadow waited outside the cabin, patient and still. The rest of the pack was nearby, watching from the tree line. "I'll be back in April," Della told him. "First week, as soon as the snow melts enough to make the hike possible. This isn't goodbye, it's just, see you later." The wolf's tail moved once, acknowledgement and acceptance. She shouldered her pack, gave the cabin one last look, and started the hike out. Kerrick walked beside her, and to her surprise, Shadow followed. They made it to the valley entrance before the big wolf stopped, unwilling to go further from the pack's territory. Della knelt and wrapped her arms around his neck, breathing in his wild scent. "Keep them safe," she whispered. "I'll be back soon." Shadow tolerated the embrace for a moment, then pulled away and trotted back toward the hidden clearing. Della watched until he disappeared, then continued down the mountain. The hike out took 2 days, and with each mile, she felt herself shifting between worlds. The guardian receding, the grandmother and mother emerging. It wasn't a comfortable transition. She felt split somehow, pulled between 2 versions of herself that didn't quite fit together yet. But they would. She'd make them fit. She'd find a way to honor both callings. When she reached her truck, she allowed herself one moment of grief for leaving, then started the engine and began the drive back to Coeur d'Alene. Linda was waiting at the condo when she arrived, having used her key to stock the refrigerator and air out the rooms. She hugged Della tightly, holding on longer than usual. "You look different," Linda said, studying her face. "Thinner. Stronger, maybe." More I don't know. More like yourself? I feel like myself, Della confirmed. More than I have in years. They spent the evening talking, Della carefully editing her stories to remove the more unbelievable elements. She talked about the valley, about her duties maintaining trails and monitoring wildlife, about the satisfaction of useful work. She mentioned seeing wolves but didn't explain their role in her life. Some truths weren't meant for sharing, not because they were shameful, but because they were too strange for easy belief. Marcus visited the next week with his family, and Della found herself genuinely happy to see them, happy to hold her grandchildren and hear about their teenage dramas and school achievements. She'd worried that the valley would make normal life feel hollow, but instead it gave her the energy to fully engage with her family. She had purpose again, which meant she had emotional resources to share. The winter months passed in a rhythm that surprised her with its comfort. She spent time with family, took shorter day hikes in the nearby mountains, and read voraciously about ecology and wildlife management. She wrote in her journal every night, processing her experiences, planning for the next season. And she waited, patiently but eagerly, she waited for spring. When April finally arrived, with the snow melt beginning in earnest and the first wildflowers pushing through the muddy ground, Della loaded her truck and made her goodbyes. "I'll see you in November," she told Linda, "weekly check-ins via satellite, just like we agreed. And if you need me urgently, I can hike out in 2 days." "I know, Mom. I just be safe, okay? You're all we've got left." "I'm safe," Della assured her. "Safer than you'd believe. I've got good partners up there." She drove back to the trailhead, her heart lighter with every mile. When she shouldered her pack and started hiking, it felt like coming home in the truest sense. The mountains welcomed her back, the forest opened its paths, and her feet found their rhythm immediately. She reached the valley on her second day, approaching through the creek drainage as the afternoon sun painted everything gold. And there, waiting at the stone circle, was Shadow and the entire pack. 7 wolves, plus 3 new pups born during the winter, all watching her approach. Kerrick broke from the group and raced toward her, tail wagging frantically, and Della dropped to her knees to embrace him. "I missed you too, boy. I missed all of this so much." Shadow approached more sedately, touched his nose to her hand in greeting, then turned and led the way to the cabin. The door opened smoothly, everything just as she'd left it. The Guardian journals on their shelf, the wood stove cold but ready, the table and chairs waiting for her return. Della unpacked her supplies, arranged her things, and sat down to write her first entry of the new season. "The 8th of April 2026, she began. "I'm back. The valley is beautiful. The pack is thriving, and I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. This is my life now, split between 2 worlds, belonging fully to both. I am a grandmother who watches over children in winter, and I am a guardian who watches over wolves and wilderness from spring through fall. I am Della Rusk. I am 63 years old, and I keep the watch." Outside, the pack howled their welcome, and Della smiled. She was home. Finally, completely, undeniably, home. The watch continued. The chain remained unbroken, and in a hidden valley deep in the Selkirk Mountains, an ancient partnership between human and wolf lived on, protected by a retired fire lookout who'd found her purpose in the most unexpected of places. Some callings choose us. Some responsibilities find us when we're ready, even if we didn't know we were searching. And some bonds between human and wild, between past and present, between duty and love, transcend everything we thought we understood about the world. Della had found all of that and more. She'd found herself, and she would keep watching, season after season, year after year, for as long as she was able. And when her time came, someone else would follow the wolves to this valley, would read her journals, and would choose to continue the watch. The chain would remain unbroken. The valley would remain protected. The partnership would endure, just as it always had, just as it always would.